I'd always thought of my life as a steady river, flowing predictably through the years with Clara by my side. We'd been married for 12 years, a partnership built on quiet routines and unspoken trust. She was a painter, her hands always flecked with colors I couldn't name, and I was an architect, sketching lines that turned into homes. Our house in Portland smelled of turpentine and cedar, a strange but comforting blend. Mornings began with coffee, black for me, a splash of cream for her, and evenings ended with her reading novels while I reviewed blueprints. It was a rhythm I cherished, a melody I assumed would play forever. But then came the shift. It was subtle at first, like a crack in a foundation you don't notice until the walls start leaning. Clara began leaving the house more often, claiming inspiration had struck. She'd pack her canvas bag, her brushes clinking softly, and vanish for hours. "The light's better by the river," she'd say, her voice light but her eyes darting away. I didn't question it. Why would I? She'd always been a creature of whims, and I loved that about her. Her art was her soul, and I'd never cage it. Yet the absences grew longer. One Tuesday, she didn't return until midnight, her hair tangled with leaves, her cheeks flushed in a way I hadn't seen since our early days. "Lost track of time," she mumbled, brushing past me to the kitchen. I nodded, sipping my cold tea, but something gnawed at me. The next week it happened again. Then again. Her excuses piled up like sketches I couldn't fit into a design. River light, a new gallery opening, a friend's sudden need for company. I began to notice her phone, always face down now, buzzing at odd hours. When I asked, she'd laugh it off. "Just spam," she'd say, her smile too wide. I wasn't a suspicious man by nature. My world was angles and measurements, not shadows and doubts. But one evening, as she slept, I saw her phone light up. A name flashed, Elliot. No last name, just Elliot. My stomach twisted. I didn't touch the phone. I couldn't bring myself to, but the name lodged in my mind like a splinter. The next day, I asked casually, "Who's Elliot?" She froze, mid-stirring her coffee, then shrugged. "Oh, an art dealer. Met him at the gallery." Her voice was smooth, but her fingers gripped the spoon too tight. I let it go, or tried to. The river of our life was veering, and I didn't know how to steer it back. Days turned into weeks, and Elliot became a ghost haunting our home. Clara never mentioned him again, but I saw his name flicker on her screen more than once. I'd catch her texting in the corner of my eye, her lips curving in a way that wasn't for me. She'd tuck the phone away when I approached, her movements quick, almost guilty. I told myself it was nothing, an art deal, a professional fling of enthusiasm. But the air between us thickened, heavy with things unsaid. Then came the package. It arrived on a rainy Thursday, a small box wrapped in brown paper, addressed to Clara. I was home early, a rare break from a project deadline, and signed for it. The return address was smudged, unreadable. I set it on the counter, intending to leave it for her, but curiosity tugged at me. I shook it gently, something soft rattled inside. When Clara came home, drenched and humming, she saw the box and stopped. "What's this?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Oh, just supplies," she said, snatching it before I could blink. She disappeared upstairs, and I heard the faint rip of tape. That night I couldn't sleep. The box gnawed at me. At 2 a.m., I crept to her studio, where she'd left it half open on her desk. Inside was a scarf, silk, deep green, embroidered with tiny birds. Not a painting supply, a gift. My chest tightened. I searched the box for a note, a clue, but found nothing. Back in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying her flustered grab, her evasiveness. The scarf wasn't for me. It wasn't from me. The next morning, she wore it. "New?" I asked, sipping my coffee. "Found it at a thrift store," she lied, her eyes avoiding mine. I nodded, but the splinter grew. I started watching her closer. How she'd linger in the bathroom, door locked, her voice a murmur through the wood. How she'd come home with dirt on her shoes, not paint. How her laughter felt rehearsed. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed proof. something solid to hold against the tide of suspicion drowning me. Proof came on a Saturday, uninvited and brutal. I'd taken to working late, burying myself in designs to avoid the tension at home. Clara had left that morning, her bag slung over her shoulder, claiming a plein air session by the coast. "Back by dinner," she'd said, kissing my cheek with lips that felt too cool. I waved her off, then sat in silence, the house too big around me. By noon, I couldn't focus. My latest project, a library with arched windows, blurred into nonsense. On impulse, I drove to the coast, telling myself I'd surprise her, bring her lunch. The beach she loved was an hour away, a stretch of sand framed by cliffs. I parked near the trailhead, scanning for her blue hatchback. It wasn't there. My gut sank, but I hiked down anyway, hoping to spot her easel against the horizon. She wasn't painting. Halfway along the shore, I saw them. Clara and a man, tangled together on a blanket beneath the cliffs. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair spilling over his forehead. Elliot, I knew instantly. Her hands were in his hair, his arms around her waist, their bodies pressed close in a way that left no room for doubt. The wind carried her laugh, sharp and carefree, a sound she hadn't made with me in years. I stood frozen, the picnic bag slipping from my hand, apples rolling into the sand. They didn't see me. I watched for what felt like hours, though it was minutes. Every touch, every glance, carved itself into me. She'd lied, not about painting, not about art, but about us. When they finally stood, brushing sand off each other, I ducked behind a dune. She looked radiant, alive in a way I couldn't remember. He kissed her forehead, and she smiled up at him, unguarded. I drove home in a daze, the image of them looping in my mind like a blueprint I couldn't erase. I didn't confront her that night. She came home at dusk, her hair salty and wild, claiming the waves had inspired her. "Made a sketch," she said, showing me a half-finished drawing of the sea. No cliffs, no blanket, no him. I nodded, my throat tight, and poured her wine. We ate in silence, the clink of forks deafening. She chattered about brushstrokes, but I barely heard her. All I saw was her on that blanket, her betrayal a living thing between us. Sleep eluded me. I lay beside her, her breathing soft and even, and felt like a stranger in my own bed. The next day I called in sick, something I never did, and dug deeper. Her phone was locked, but I found an old sketchbook in her studio, tucked behind a canvas. Inside were doodles, dates, and his name, Elliot, scrawled in margins, paired with hearts. One entry read, "E's Cabin, July 10th, from months ago." My hands shook as I flipped pages, tracing their secret timeline. I searched online next. Elliot Grayson, local photographer, popped up on a gallery site. His face matched the man on the beach, smirking, confident, everything I wasn't. His bio mentioned a cabin in the woods, a retreat for creatives. Clara had been there, I realized, on nights she'd claimed exhaustion or friend visits. The pieces clicked together, a structure of deceit I'd been too blind to see. I wasn't just losing her, I'd already lost her. Anger came slow, then all at once. I didn't yell or smash things, that wasn't me. Instead, I planned. Clara had taken my trust, my years, and twisted them into something unrecognizable. She'd live with consequences, ones she couldn't paint away. I'd make her feel the weight of her choices, not with words, but with precision. First, I tracked Elliot. His cabin was an hour north, a secluded spot I found on a county map. I drove there one afternoon while Clara was out painting, parking a mile away and hiking in. The place was rustic, all logs and glass, with a porch overlooking a creek. I didn't go inside, just watched. His truck was there, and soon so was her car. They emerged together, laughing, her arm looped through his. I took photos, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. Next, I gathered evidence. Bank statements showed withdrawals I hadn't noticed, hundreds spent on supplies that never appeared. Her email, hacked with a guess at her password, our anniversary, ironically, revealed messages. "Can't wait to see you," he'd written. "You're my muse." she'd replied. Each word fueled me. I compiled it all, photos, texts, dates, into a file. But exposure wasn't enough. I wanted more than shame. I wanted ruin. The plan took shape over weeks. Elliot's photography career relied on reputation. Clara's art thrived on her charm. I'd dismantle both, piece by piece, and they'd never see it coming. Revenge wasn't loud. It was a quiet, calculated thing, like drafting a building meant to collapse on its own weight. And I was good at building. Revenge, I learned, is an art form of its own. It's not impulsive or loud. It's a structure, carefully designed, every beam and joint placed with intent. I spent nights in my study, the glow of my laptop casting shadows across blueprints I no longer cared about. My focus was singular. Clara and Elliot would feel the collapse of their world, and I'd be the architect of it. The file I'd built, photos, emails, bank records, was my foundation. Now I needed leverage. Elliot's photography career was my first target. He wasn't just a hobbyist. He'd won awards, had exhibits in Seattle and Portland, sold prints to collectors. His reputation was pristine, a glass tower begging to be shattered. I dug into his online presence, social media, gallery reviews, client lists. A pattern emerged. He thrived on praise, on being seen as a visionary. I could use that. Posing as an anonymous tipster, I emailed a local art critic, hinting at unethical practices in Elliot's work. No specifics, just enough to spark curiosity. Within days, whispers started online, nothing concrete, but a crack in his polished image. Clara was trickier. Her art wasn't as public, but her charm was her currency. She'd built a network of admirers, gallery owners, fellow painters, buyers, who saw her as a free spirit, untouchable. I couldn't touch her paintings, but I could taint the air around her. I started small, planting seeds. At a dinner with mutual friends, I let slip a vague comment. Clara's been so secretive lately. Must be a big project. Eyes turned, questions lingered. She laughed it off, but I saw the flicker of unease in her posture. Doubt was a slow poison, and I'd just begun to pour. At home, I played the oblivious husband. I cooked her favorite meals, asked about her day, kept my voice steady. She'd ramble about landscapes and light, her lies piling up like wet paint. I nodded, smiled, and watched her phone buzz with his name. Every moment of normalcy was a brick in my plan, keeping her blind to the scaffolding rising around her. Elliot's world began to tilt first. The critic I'd tipped off dug deeper, and soon a blog post appeared. Nothing damning, just speculation about borrowed inspiration in his latest series. Forums picked it up, art snobs debating his originality. I fueled the fire, using a burner account to post a blurry photo, Clara's sketchbook, his name doodled beside a wave that matched his award-winning print. Coincidence, I wrote. The thread exploded. Galleries started asking questions. A Seattle show postponed, pending review. I watched it unfold from my desk, a quiet thrill humming through me. Clara noticed the shift in him before she connected it to herself. Elliot's stressed, she said one night, stirring soup absently. Some nonsense online. I raised an eyebrow, feigning concern. About his work? She nodded, distracted, and I hid my smirk behind a sip of water. She didn't suspect me, not yet. Her focus was on soothing him, her evenings stretching longer as she helped him through it. I let her go, knowing every trip to his cabin tightened the noose I was weaving. Meanwhile, I turned up the heat on her. I contacted a gallery owner she admired, posing as a concerned friend. Clara's been unwell, I lied. Hiding something, maybe. I'd hate for it to affect her next show. The owner, a gossip at heart, spread the rumor. Soon, her circle buzzed with whispers. Clara's secrecy, her odd hours. A buyer backed out of a commission, citing uncertainty. She came home fuming one day, ranting about small-minded people. I listened, all sympathy, while my mind mapped the next move. The beauty of it was its subtlety. No grand accusations, no shouting matches, just a slow unraveling they couldn't trace. I was a ghost in their lives, pulling strings they didn't see. I needed more than rumors. I needed them to see themselves, to feel the rot they'd sown. One rainy afternoon, I drove to Elliot's cabin again, this time with a purpose. His truck was gone, the place empty. I'd watched their patterns. Tuesday was his gallery day, her river sketching excuse. The lock was simple. A pin and a twist of wire from my toolbox did the trick. Inside, the air smelled of pine and her perfume. My stomach churned, but I pressed on. Their world was everywhere. Her scarf draped over a chair, his camera on the counter, a half-empty wine bottle from a vineyard we'd visited together years ago. I found a stack of photos in a drawer. Clara laughing, her hair wild, his lens worshipping her. I took a few, then set up my own mirror. I brought a small projector, battery-powered, discreet. I loaded it with my evidence, beach photos, emails, her doodles, and aimed it at the cabin's largest wall. When they returned, they'd see their betrayal in flickering light, inescapable. I left no trace, locking the door behind me. That night, Clara came home late, pale and trembling. "Something weird happened," she said, voice shaky. "At Elliot's place." I tilted my head, all innocence. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then muttered about lights acting up. I pressed gently, and she snapped, "It's nothing." But her eyes were haunted. The projector had worked, they'd seen it. I didn't ask more, letting her stew in the unease I'd planted. Elliot's next move confirmed it. His social media went silent, no witty captions or new shots. A friend texted me, casual as ever, "Heard Elliot's freaking out. Some prank at his cabin." I replied with a shrug emoji, my pulse steady. They were cracking, and I was just getting started. Clara's unraveling was quieter but no less satisfying. She stopped painting, her studio gathering dust. "I'm blocked," she'd say, staring at blank canvases. I'd nod, offering tea, while inside I gloated. Her network was shrinking. Another buyer canceled. A gallery delayed her feature. Whispers had turned to distance. People didn't trust what they couldn't define. She'd pace at night, muttering about bad luck, her phone buzzing less often. Elliot was pulling away, I could tell, his own mess consuming him. I tightened the screws. Using a fake email, I sent galleries anonymous tips, photos of Clara and Elliot, timestamps matching her solo trips. "Conflict of interest?" I wrote. One gallery dropped her entirely, citing professional concerns. She got the call while I was home, her face crumpling as she hung up. "They think I'm a fraud," she whispered. I hugged her, my arms a cage of false comfort, and murmured, "You'll figure it out." Elliot's career teetered. A major client pulled funding after a source, me, leaked altered metadata, suggesting he'd staged shots he'd claimed were candid. Critics pounced, his name trending for all the wrong reasons. I watched Clara try to reach him, her calls going unanswered. "He's not himself," she said, voice breaking. I wondered if she saw the irony. Neither was she. At home, I kept the facade. I'd hum while cooking, ask about her day, act like the river still flowed. But she was fraying, snapping at small things, avoiding my gaze. The projector had been phase one. Now I'd build the final collapse. They'd hurt me in shadows, and I'd bury them in light. The endgame loomed, and I savored its shape. Elliot's next exhibit was in 2 weeks. A comeback attempt, a desperate grasp at relevance. I'd make it his tomb. I'd collected more. Recordings from a tiny mic I'd slipped into her bag, capturing their frantic whispers about who knows. I edited them into a loop, their voices confessing without context, and planned to hijack his show. A hacked projector, a time switch, his audience would hear their unraveling live. Clara's fate was simpler but sharper. I'd sell the house, her sanctuary, and vanish with the proceeds. She'd wake to an empty shell, her lies her only company. I met with a realtor in secret, listing it under a shell company. Papers were signed, my escape secured. She'd lose everything. Her home, her art, her lover. In one clean cut. That night, I watched her sleep, her face soft with exhaustion. I felt no pity, only the cold satisfaction of a plan nearing completion. The river had dried up, and I'd built a dam in its place. Soon they'd drown in it. The days before Elliot's exhibit ticked by like a metronome, steady and unyielding. I'd perfected the audio loop. Clara's voice, soft and panicked, saying, "What if someone knows?" Layered with Elliot's gruff, "We'll handle it. No names. Just enough to damn them in a room full of art world vultures." I'd rented a projector under a fake name, tested its range, and mapped the gallery's layout from a public tour. My hands didn't shake as I soldered wires or synced timers. This was my craft now, as precise as any building I designed. Clara was a ghost in our home. She'd stopped leaving, stopped pretending. Her easel stood empty, her brushes dry. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she'd mutter, staring out windows streaked with March rain. I'd murmur comforts, my voice a mask, while I packed my life into boxes she didn't see. The realtor had buyers lined up, cash, quick, no questions. I'd told Clara I was organizing the garage, and she didn't care enough to check. Her world was shrinking, and I was the shadow closing it in. Elliot's online presence flickered, a defiant post about truth in art that drew more scorn than support. I smiled at my screen, knowing his comeback would be a grave. I'd sent one last anonymous tip to a rival photographer, a zip file of his cabin photos with Clara, time-stamped against his solo retreat claims. The rival replied, "This is gold." By morning, a scathing exposé hit a niche blog, calling him a fraud who stole muses. His sponsors wavered. The exhibit was his last stand. I'd make sure it fell. At night, I'd sit with Clara, the TV droning, and feel the weight of my plans settle. She'd reach for my hand sometimes, her touch tentative, and I'd let her hold it. It was the last warmth she'd get from me. The gallery buzzed on opening night, a sleek space of white walls and sharp angles. I'd slipped in early, a nondescript figure in a borrowed coat, and rigged the projector above a lighting rig. It was small, wireless, timed to trigger mid-speech. The audio file was loaded, volume calibrated to cut through chatter. I left before the crowd arrived, driving to a bar 2 blocks away to watch the fallout online. Elliot took the stage at 8 p.m., his voice booming through a live stream. He wore a forced grin, talking about resilience and vision. The room clapped, tentative but polite. Then it happened, my timer hit 0. The projector flared to life, and their voices spilled out, "What if someone knows? We'll handle it." Over and over, a haunting echo. Faces turned, murmurs rose. Elliot froze, his mouth open mid-sentence. Someone yelled, "What's this?" The screen stayed blank, no visuals, just sound. But the damage was instant. Social media erupted. Clips of the loop spread, paired with the exposé's photos. "Cheater, liar, who's the woman?" trended within minutes. Elliot stammered, tried to laugh it off, but the crowd thinned. A sponsor stormed out. A critic typed furiously on her phone. I sipped my whiskey, watching his tower crumble. By 9:30, the gallery was half empty, his name a punchline. He'd never recover, not from this. Clara called me at 10, her voice shrill. "Elliot's a mess. Something happened at his show." I feigned surprise. "What kind of mess?" She didn't know details, just that he'd shut down, wouldn't talk. "I'm going to him," she said. I didn't stop her. Let her run to his wreckage. It'd only deepen hers. I moved that night. Clara was gone, chasing Elliot's ruins, and I loaded my car with what mattered. Clothes, designs, the file that had undone them. The house was under contract. The buyers would take it in 48 hours. I'd left no note, no trace beyond the essentials she'd expect to see. The river of our life was dry, and I'd diverted its last drops. I drove to a motel an hour east, paid cash, and slept dreamlessly. Morning brought news. Elliot's exhibit canceled. His career on indefinite hold. Clara's name surfaced too, linked by photos, her art circle turning cold. A friend texted me, "Heard about Clara and some guy, true?" I didn't reply. Let them speculate. I was a ghost now. The realtor called at noon, closing was set. I wired my share to a new account, untraceable, and booked a flight to Denver. I'd start over, build something new, free of her shadow. Clara would return to an empty house, her key turning in a lock that no longer belonged to her. I pictured her face. Confusion, then panic, and felt a cold satisfaction. She'd built her betrayal. I'd built its consequence. Elliot's fall continued online. Clients sued. Galleries blacklisted him. A grainy video showed him shouting at reporters outside his cabin. His charm gone. I didn't watch long. His end was done. Clara found out 2 days later. The realtor, per my instructions, left a letter. Property sold. Contact your husband. She called me, her voice a storm of tears and rage. Where are you? What did you do? I let it ring, then blocked her number. She'd piece it together. The house gone, her lover broken, her art tainted. Friends sent screenshots. Clara at our door, pounding, neighbors watching. She's lost it. One wrote. I didn't care. Elliot vanished from the grid. Rumors said he'd sold the cabin, fled north. His photos, once prized, sat unsold, mocked online. Clara's paintings followed. Galleries pulled them. Buyers ghosted her. Her name became a whisper, then silence. I tracked it from Denver, my new apartment sparse but mine. The file stayed with me, a trophy I'd never show. She tried reaching me through others, emails, mutual friends. She's sorry, they'd say. She's broken. I ignored them. Sorry didn't rebuild trust. Broken didn't erase her choices. I'd given her a life, and she'd traded it for a blanket on a beach. Now she had nothing. I started work again, drafting homes for strangers. The past faded, but the plan's echo lingered. A perfect design, executed without flaw. Months passed, and I stood on firm ground. Denver's air was crisp, its lines clean. A canvas I could shape. My name stayed untarnished. No one here knew Clara, Elliot, or the river I'd left behind. I heard scraps. She'd moved to a cheap rental, sold what art she could, lived small. Elliot resurfaced in Canada, shooting weddings for cash, a shadow of his old self. Their worlds had collapsed, and I'd walked away whole. I didn't gloat, not outwardly. The revenge wasn't for show. It was for me, a reclamation. Clara's betrayal had been a quiet knife. Mine was a silent storm. She'd sought passion in shadows, and I'd turned light into her punishment. Elliot's arrogance had begged for a fall, and I'd obliged. They'd never know it was me, not fully, but they'd feel it forever. One evening, I stood on my balcony, coffee in hand, watching the sun dip behind mountains. The river was gone, replaced by a horizon I'd built. I didn't need her, didn't miss her. The plan had been my final blueprint with her name on it, and I'd executed it perfectly. Life moved on, and so did I, unburdened, unbowed, the architect of their end and my beginning.